The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your co-hosts, James Floyd. I am a Star Wars writer for Star Wars Insider magazine and the author of Star Wars crossword puzzles and other word games from a galaxy far, far away.
So awesome. I am Melissa Miller, your other co-host, and I'm a science writer and scientist and also write for Star Wars Insider magazine. On this episode, Star Warsologies is going to chat about authoritarianism and anti-fascism in Star Wars. Our guest expert today is Chris Kempshall, who is a World War I historian and author of The History and Politics of Star Wars, Death Stars, and Democracy. Welcome, Chris.
Hello. It's good to be back. I have regenerated.
All right. Well, it's good to see you again, Chris.
Thank you for having me back.
Yeah.
Yes, we had a really fun time at Celebration. You did an amazing panel about history and Star Wars that was, packed to the gills, lots of good stuff. And it's great to have you on to talk about this timely topic.
We've gone for the uplifting one.
Yeah.
Well, before we dive into it, can you tell us a little bit about what history is and what a historian is and how you got into this field? Did Star Wars contribute to this?
What I love about that question is it's the type of question that, if unrestrained, like a historian will fill a podcast with about what history is and what a historian is.
Right.
I'm gonna try and pare this down to a round 48-minute explanation. To my mind, there are two different things that are meant by the term history. There's the past. A bunch of stuff happened in the past. There was Napoleon was a guy. The First World War happened. Somebody invented the wheel. All of the things that happened in the past. When I talk about history, it's the study of the past as understood by historians. And that is not the same as things that happened in the past. History, as I understand it with like a capital H, is the way that historians make sense of the past and the way that they argue and try and debate and try and define an understanding of the things that have happened before now. And the job of a historian, which is something that I think that people don't really understand, and it's like an ongoing bugbear of mine. And I've probably ranted about it either in person with you both or on one of our previous podcasts, that people seem to think that historians are a mix of like an encyclopedia and a chronicler. They're just there to tell you stuff that happened. It's like on 1066, William the Conqueror invaded England and ruled it and conquered it and all that type of stuff.
Right.
And that's not what historians are for. We're not here just to pass you on like the unfiltered events of a bygone age. We're here to explain or try to explain why we think these things happened in the way that they happened and try and analyse the context created by these events happening and the impacts it might have on us now and the impacts they might have had on us on the time. So historians exist to argue and we exist to rewrite history, to discover and learn more and think about things and then change the way that people think about things about the past. It's why new history books come out. You don't just go into a Barnes & Noble and here are the history books. They haven't changed because the first time somebody wrote about it, they were correct. And there was no reason to write a book. There's only one book about the Second World War. And there's only one book about the Victorians or the Vietnam War. Because that isn't the case, it's because historians are always revising our understanding of the past. We exist to argue, we exist to debate, we exist to illuminate. That is our purpose. We exist to rewrite history.
Okay. And so what was your sort of journey into making this into your career and also, your Star Wars story a little bit and if they interweave at all?
So this is the point when the wheels come off and I just look like an idiot. In that I never wanted to be a historian. I wanted to be a soccer commentator. Mm. And I didn't study history. I stopped studying history at secondary school, which is high school equivalent for the Americans. I didn't study history at university. For when I was doing my undergraduate degree, I studied media because I wanted to be a soccer commentator.
Right.
And then I realised that actually it's really hard to be a soccer commentator. There aren't that many that you need. And most of the companies seem to be full. So I panicked and I did an MA which was kind of an international relations field. It was called Contemporary War and Peace Studies. I'd done like a little bit of around historical warfare very narrowly at university, like little courses you could almost take on the side, not even like a minor degree for American audiences. It was just like a random course here and there that I could take. And I took that because I panicked. I had a great time and then I was tired and I tried to do other things and I didn't like them. And I developed over time this interest in the First World War. And the idea that the reality of the First World War is not the same as how we remember the First World War. The memory of it had evolved over time. And that was like a radical concept to me, that, you know, we might not remember things accurately. Like, God, my students just mock me to my face and they do, or they have when I've told this story to them before. So then I went and did a PhD in history, and it was in Allied relations in the First World War. And that was how I kind of became a historian with a capital H. And I don't necessarily know if Star Wars played much of a role in that, except for the fact that I really liked Star Wars. And even when I was doing like degree stuff, I was eating up Star Wars books, or I was playing Star Wars games and the like. And when I finished my PhD, I was tired again and never really I didn't want to look at Allied relations for, you know, at least 6 or 7 ice ages. And I decided that because I was a geek and that I liked computer games, I'd do some stuff about the First World War in computer games. Like, how is history represented in computer game form?
Right.
And from that, it evolved. I got the opportunity to kind of expand on that. An editor at the publisher called Routledge said, you know, your computer game stuff has done well. Do you want to write another book, or do you want to do something else? And I was like, what are we talking about here? Are we talking First World War, or are we talking, you know, stupid geeky nonsense? And he was like, whatever you want, really. And I was like,
wow.
I want to write a book about how the Star Wars franchise portrays real-world history and real-world politics. That was how I got the chance to write the history and politics of Star Wars. So it kind of evolved out of my interest in history, but it was always constantly at that meeting point of me turning my daft geeky interests to look at properly.
Very cool.
I'm not very cool.
No,
nothing that I just said is the words of someone who is very cool.
No, it's very cool. I agree.
I think you are one of the coolest people I know, which maybe doesn't say much for the people I know, but you know.
No, but in this conversation and to our listeners, like, that is very cool. Okay, some people are still stuck, you know, just talking about World War I, and here you get to talk about the changing, you know, ways to think about history show up in our popular culture, which is honestly the only way I can think of right now to talk about, you know, some politics and things like that. You know,
my academic career. I left academia last year because I couldn't get a job in UK academia because they wouldn't accept the computer game and the Star Wars stuff.
Wow.
So whilst being cool with an asterisk was a fun thing, it did come at a weird cost that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, that's really surprising to me. I don't know enough about academia, you know, in the States to know if that would be an issue, but like, at least me as a science communicator, I want academics who can talk about things in pop culture contexts, because that's what people are going to understand over like Thanksgiving dinner. That's what people are going to understand, you know, out chatting, you know, while you're waiting in line somewhere or whatever. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And this kind of like the crux of this conversation to me. Like, people are saying like, oh, Star Wars got woke and all of a sudden is like, you know, anti-establishment. And I'm like, guys, like, literally always has been. This comes up with Star Trek too and all that kind of stuff. Like, no, it's literally woven in here. So
yeah, it's like gravity. You can't get away from it.
Right.
Well, yeah. I do want to mention that obviously this is a very timely topic, as Melissa said. Just to kind of put where we are right now, we're recording on June 13th, which is only a month after the finale of Andor Season 2, with the genocide on Gorman, and just a week into the events unfolding in Los Angeles between ICE and the people of Los Angeles. This is the day before the June 14th Day of Defiance, and just yesterday, Senator Alex Padilla of California was handcuffed for being at a Kristi Noem press conference and trying to ask questions. So things are getting a little too similar between things going on here in California and in Star Wars. Obviously, we had the Gorman senator get arrested. Let's just take kind of a bigger macro view. What is the difference between fascism and authoritarianism?
Well, we're starting with the big ones. Again, you know, people have written entire books about this, and I'll start with a caveat, not a political scientist, but I'm a historian, and I think I can try and kind of weave through this. But if anybody's sitting there going, oh, hang on a minute, those definitions aren't quite right. And it's one of those things that people use authoritarian and fascism effectively interchangeably. Authoritarianism, totalitarianism, fascism, they're generally used to mean the same thing. But there are important differences between them in the sense that you can do that kind of all fascists are authoritarian, not all authoritarians are fascists. That kind of weird is maybe a useful rule of thumb, but there are important ideological differences about them. Obviously both of them are focused on control and maintaining control and centralizing control within the body of the authoritarian. But authoritarianism can tend at times to be more kind of conservative with a small c. It's about maintaining a society almost within a specific moment in time. And the authoritarian is looking to kind of keep some elements frozen in time. They'll do that violently. Often, authoritarianism often relates to violence, but it's not as explicitly violent as fascism is as an ideology. Fascism is built on concepts of conflict and violence. It is in its DNA. Fascism is inherently violent. Fascism is often inherently expansionary. It's often inherently eliminationist of its enemies, and how it defines them. Authoritarians lock up their enemies all the time. I suppose it's one of the perks of being an authoritarian is that you can just treat people however you want. But authoritarianism is not always genocidal, and fascism often is genocidal. And fascism looks to expand its own borders. It looks to very clearly define its enemies, both within and without, and then kill them. And it acts to mobilize its population to violence. Now, within that, again, you get crossovers, and these aren't just kind of crossovers necessarily between fascism or authoritarianism, because you can see the examples of them in communist societies as well. The concept of the leader as the center of the universe, effectively. And that's true if you're talking about Mussolini, it's true if you're talking about Hitler, it's true if you're talking about Stalin with his cult of personality, it's true if you're talking about Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il, that, they come to represent perfection in its various forms. With fascism, more importantly, they seek to blur the lines between the state and the person. Hitler is Germany. If Hitler is to die, then Germany is to die. So in that aspect, the ruler becomes the representative of the body politic and the population. And loyalty to the leader is loyalty to the country, but is more important than loyalty to the country. People in the Third Reich, in the military, in Nazi Germany, swear a loyalty oath to the Fuhrer. They don't swear that loyalty oath simply to the Vaterland. They swear it to Hitler, because Hitler is the fatherland. He's the father of the nation.
And how do you see those both or either reflected in Star Wars? Like, what are the sort of obvious examples of either fascism or authoritarianism?
Yeah. You get both. And what's interesting about Star Wars, both in the new kind of Disney canon and the old expanded universe legends, is that the Empire, which is what we're talking about, effectively, if we're going to start talking about authoritarianism and fascism, we're going to talk about the Empire, that their ideology is a perfect example of incoherent coherence, in that it's whatever you want it to be, but everybody knows what it is. When George Lucas is writing down in the first scripts of the Star Wars, he describes the Empire as America after it's fallen to fascism.
Wow. I don't know if most people know that.
It's like virtually the first things he ever writes about Star Wars, which is one of the things that with history and politics, when, I'm trying to beat people to death with the reality of the political nature of Star Wars. It's like, how could Star Wars not be political when, the first paragraph that George Lucas ever writes includes a reference to the Empire being America fallen to fascism? I mean, I'm pretty sure he then describes the rebels living on a planet like Vietnam. It's like, yeah, there you go. That's the answer to all of the criticism about Star Wars being political. It's right there. It's the first thing that George Lucas ever writes. Wow. But George Lucas has what I refer to as a pop culture interaction with history. And you see it in the original trilogy, and you see it in the old expanded universe, in that, to him, fascism is something that you are rather than something that you do. So the Empire are the bad guys, which makes them fascists, because the bad guys are fascists. That's how you know that somebody's a bad guy. It's because they're a fascist. But fascism isn't just something that you are. Fascism is an active thing. Fascism is an ideology. It's something that you do. You have fascist beliefs. You act in fascistic ways. You kill people for fascistic reasons. You expand your borders because that's what fascism does. It's not just because you're an evil guy. And in the old expanded universe, the Empire's ideology either isn't there in the original trilogy. It's never actually explained why the Empire is doing the things that they're doing, except for the fact that they're evil, and that's,
what you do.
Criticism. That's
right.
It works. And even in the old expanded universe novels, we hear about them being human supremacists. We hear the anti-alien bias. We hear about the patriarchal bias, the misogyny. We hear about the genocides and all of those different bits and pieces. But the actual ideology of it is a bit loosey-goosey at times. It's a slightly pick a mix of, it's the Soviet Union's socialist communism, it's the Nazis, it's America and Vietnam, it's whatever the story needs it to be, which is fine. That's not a criticism. George Lucas isn't under the obligation to act like a historian. What we see now in the Disney canon, I think, is approaching the point of being more overtly fascist rather than just, here's a collection of stuff that the bad guys do.
Right.
And, you see it in Andor that, the reason why the Empire does the things that it does is not just because they're all mustachio-twirling villainous scumbags. It's because of the ideology. It's because they like imperialism.
Right.
The Emperor's New Order. So they will kill the population of Gorman and other worlds because that's what they want to do. That's what their ideology allows them to do. It's what their ideology almost insists that they do, because to be fascistic on some level is to be genocidal. And the requirements of the Emperor, what Palpatine wants, as seen through what the Imperial State wants, is utmost of importance. Therefore, everything else is subservient to doing the things that Palpatine and the Empire requires, which means that they are going to just kill protesters, they are going to raise planets, they are going to commit genocides because they're fascists, and that's what fascists do.
Yeah. It's certainly something I'm sure I noticed before, but in Andor it was really obvious to me because we're seeing so much more of the Empire that there's only humans in those Imperial uniforms, right? And it's obvious, right? If I know if I go back and watch A New Hope, that's all there is. And then you go to something like Mos Eisley and it's very clear we've got hundreds and hundreds of other species. So this is a choice. This is a exclusive club.
There's a slight kind of post hoc element to it, because we all know that the real reason is that humans exist and aliens are expensive to make. That's why all of the Imperial characters in Star Wars, but also there aren't any aliens in the Rebels in A New Hope either, except for Chewbacca. And there aren't any aliens in the Rebellion at Hoth in Empire Strikes Back either. It's only when you get to the Return of the Jedi that you actually start to see aliens in the Rebellion.
Okay.
Yeah, you get a bigger budget. You can only make Admiral Akbar and 3 other Mon Calamari and a couple of Dracelians, and that's it. But
you say that, but what about the Mos Eisley Cantina? Why not take any of those guys out of a bar and put them in a uniform or put them in an X-wing, right? It was an option, so I don't want to just brush over that.
It's weirder that that's an option that isn't taken for the Rebels than it is for the Empire.
Right.
Because actually having a bunch of upper-class British stage and screen actors being Imperial bad guys makes perfect sense for the message that you're trying to put across. There is no alien that you can put next to Peter Cushing that's gonna do anything other than make Peter Cushing look stupider as Grand Moff Tarkin. He is perfect in that, and so is everybody around him.
I think, going to that, when I was young and then later on when I got on the internet, nobody really knew about this. George Lucas saying the Empire is America but under fascism. We drew the parallels of the British Empire because, everyone talks with the British accent, and
why wouldn't you?
And then, and of course, the British Empire being all expansionary. And then also, of course, the Roman Empire, because they had an actual emperor. And, they had a Senate which got dissolved as they fell into empire. And then, of course, Nazi Germany, because you have something called literally stormtroopers, which is what the Germans call their soldiers. The first clue there. And then, of course, them with a Death Star and, blowing up Alderaan and such. But flipping that, what is the difference between resistance and rebellion both on Earth and in Star Wars?
Yeah, just to go back to that last point, and the other obvious one that people take, because it's the Cold War, is, the bad guys are the Soviet Union. It's Hollywood. The bad guys are always the Soviet Union in anything about kind of politics and the like. So a lot of people leave the cinema thinking the rebels are America and the Empire is Russia, and that's the lesson that they take from it. For rebellion and resistance, again, one of the interesting things that you see in that original trilogy is whilst George Lucas doesn't go to an awful lot of trouble explaining why the Empire does the things it does, he goes to even less trouble explaining why the rebels do the things that they do. Except for the Empire are bad guys and we should overthrow them, which is fine. Feels pretty solid.
In the opening crawl of A New Hope, they say that, these are freedom fighters trying to restore justice to the galaxy, but really it's just a bunch of friends and we care about them because they're friends.
Yeah, and they're fun and they're wacky. And, George Lucas, when he's writing it and he conceives of the Rebel Alliance as the Viet Cong, they're fighting a guerrilla war in the jungle, in temples, against an imperial power with the strength to destroy the world. It's the Vietnam War. But, you can say a lot about the Viet Cong, but they did have an ideology. They were very clear in what it is that they were fighting for and the political motivations behind it, but you don't see that for the rebels. So one of the interesting things is that it's a rebellion shorn of politics and shorn of what appears to be a vision for victory except for a galaxy without the Empire. And again, it's not the worst starting point in the world for, let's get rid of the Empire and then we'll fix it afterwards. And you see that, to an extent, in the real world. You do get resistance movements, during the Second World War, which are, the start and end point is, get rid of the Nazis. We don't want the occupation of our country, and we'll figure out what our country looks like afterwards. So, there is a real world element to that. But then you also get, hyper fanatical, ideologically motivated resistance as well, communist cells during the Second World War or fascist resistance in various countries. Even in the Cold War, during the 1960s, 70s and 80s, honestly, you could walk around Europe only stepping on the heads of randomly heavily armed militia units in Europe, like Red Army faction and the Red Hand and all of these kind of weird anti-capitalist, communist, neo-fascist, whatever the hell it is that they're trying to do, who are doing it for the cause. And you have those two things that exist, cohabit, that you have those who are super ideologically motivated and those whose view is not necessarily much beyond the week ahead of them. And one of the things that I think is really interesting in Andor is that you get both of those. You get those who are just in it to get rid of the Empire, and then you've got those who are part of disparate ideologies. One of my favourite things in the first season of Andor is when Saw Gerrera is berating the politics of everybody else in the rebellion.
Right.
And, there are separatists and human cultists and, there are those losers who wear shoes on a Thursday, and every right-minded person in the galaxy knows you wear socks on a Thursday and you wear shoes on a Friday. And it's the internecine, interfactional mess of rebellion and resistance, which is so on the nose, both in regards to actual resistance to oppressive regimes, but also anybody who has spent even 15 minutes in left-wing politics has encountered the insane factionality of the left and the fights to the death within those factions to ensure that their guy gets to be second deputy undersecretary of paperclips, because that's the only way the revolution's going to survive. And it's pretty on the nose, to be fair. Tony Gilroy has done his homework and has nailed it.
Right. Yeah, I actually wanted more of that, I have to say. So I know I'll get the fanboys or whatever upset about this, but I don't actually love Andor. I think I wanted a different story. I wanted more about the rebellion, more about the resistance, actually more about those factions, because it's a part of Rogue One I found really intriguing. And of course, once I thought about it, yes, that must exist. I think I'm going back to Life of Brian, Monty Python, being the people, right?
The Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea.
It's they hate each other, or those sorts of things.
Wearing T-shirts of the Jeddah People's Front and the People's Front of Jeddah.
Perfect.
As the Star Wars alternative.
Perfect. No, that's exactly right. So it gives me those, and I wanted more of that and less of the Empire, because I'm sold, right? Fascism is bad. I don't actually need to see 24 hours literally of more fascism, but I see now that it's wrapped up, that you needed both sides of the story, all sides of the story. We needed all that nonsense with Dedra or whatever so that we had it, pay off. We understand. But that's my sort of issue with it. So it's interesting to hear more about all of the different ones, and Luthen's role in all of this too, is maybe those are the people we don't hear about in history, but for you watching Andor, is that someone that you can identify as a type of person that's part of a rebellion?
I mean, yeah, I strongly suspect that there are people who act as linking nodes. And, particularly if you think about kind of asymmetric warfare, insurrectionist movements, even effectively terrorist movements, which is what the rebellion is billed as, that work on a cell structure that, you know, the people in the cell only know the people in the cell, is that there are then those people who can link between those and act as an axis, for want of a better, for a better word. I can't immediately, think of any kind of specific individuals off the top of my head. But what I find super interesting about Luthen isn't just that he, you know, is acting as this person who's going between them all. That, you know, the outcome of a lot of his activities is that the Yavin cell gains supremacy over the rebels, despite the fact that clearly he's been ostracized by the Yavin cell and isn't particularly convinced about it. Kleia doesn't appear to want to go to Yavin when she's being rescued, you know, not necessarily viewing them as either fully committed or whatever. But having Mon Mothma not simply rescued from the Senate, but rescued from the Senate and delivered to the Yavin cell, what I think is a really interesting insight into the rebel hierarchy, that, you know, the reason why Mon Mothma ends up becoming the leader of the rebellion is because she gets rescued and delivered to the Yavin cell and they destroy the Death Star. And that kind of grants the Rebel Alliance's legitimacy within that section of the rebellion.
Right. And you just mentioned the Rebel Alliance, that they are coming together from different groups. You know, we see, you know, not only is there an axis on which things turn, but there's also a fulcrum, that helps move things along. But, you know, Luthen obviously has his own goal of just like, we need to hit the Empire hard so that the rebellion can resist and grow. And, you know, he's obviously like pushing basically just for direct confrontation, whereas other ones are like, the Ghost Crew at the beginning, they're not fighting the Empire so much as they are trying to mitigate the damage the Empire is doing on Lothal.
Yes, 100%. And there's a good book that explains that Princess Leia isn't a rebel, she's a revolutionary. That Princess Leia, particularly in the old expanded universe, is the one who ends up having the ideology. In that there's an element to the Rebel Alliance that is incredibly conservative. It's not overthrow the galaxy, overthrow the Empire, create something super fantastic and shiny and new. It's overthrow the Empire and go back to the Republic. It's a conservative rebellion to reinstate that which had gone before. Whereas at times Princess Leia comes off as a revolutionary. She doesn't want to simply just destroy the Empire and have the old Republic back. She wants something that's better. She wants something that's newer, that works, because the Republic was dreadful. Yeah, okay, fine, Palpatine's manipulating it and doing all of those stuff, but he's not doing all of it. He's not creating problems that weren't already there. And the idea of simply, okay, we're going to get rid of the Empire and go back to that, I think is probably going to be a tough sell to some of those rebel groups, particularly those of them who used to be separatists, who didn't like the Republic any more than they necessarily liked the Empire. That, oh, you know, our solution to this problem is that thing that you previously hated, is not necessarily going to get people manning the barricades.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of ones that are just like, we want to throw the Empire and just go back to being ourselves, you know, not part of anything bigger.
Yeah, and you can't make us.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that, right? If, like, this is what it eventually leads to. Like, think about some planet who joined, you know, the Republic, like, I don't know, one generation before everything went down. They're like, no, we're good. We were good. It's fine.
Yeah, turns out you guys suck.
Right.
We're doing fine by ourselves.
Yeah, and that kind of brings in then a separate angle of colonialism, that the Empire is a colonizer in many worlds. And so it becomes not so much a civil war, but an anti-colonial war that is just like, we just want to be free to choose our own way.
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing that's also come up in more recent canon, because this is the book that Kevin J. Watmore wrote. It's a really good book. It's called The Empire Triumphant. It's a study of Star Wars, where he makes the argument for the old original trilogy in the old expanded universe. How imperial is the Empire? Because empires push out their boundaries. They take on colonies, they expand their territory. That's kind of the point of that being an empire. You know, even landlocked empires or kind of like continental empires like the Soviet Union are about increasing their spheres of influence and increasing their level of territory. We don't necessarily see in the old original trilogy the Empire having colonies, for example, but we do see them on Tatooine existing in some way as kind of an imperial presence, and we learn, you know, from the prequel trilogies that the Republic didn't exist on Tatooine, and now the Empire by the original trilogy does exist on Tatooine. So they have become more expansionary in that sense. But in the new Disney canon, we do see far more explicitly that the Empire is expansionist. That they are looking to take on new territory and more land, because they're also extractionist. They want the resources, they want the stuff. Death Stars don't make themselves. You're going to have to harvest a bunch of worlds to get that stuff. And once that world is empty, you're going to need to harvest their next door neighbor. There is no necessarily hard end to what the Empire views as being its own.
I mean, just because we're sort of alluding to Gorman here, that scene, of the sort of engineered violent protests or whatever on Gorman is something that's really, really stuck with me even before the events going on in Los Angeles right now. Early on in the arc or whatever, they're talking about, like, you have to make sure this planet has a reliable resistance.
Yeah.
It's like you literally needed them to resist in order to, like, really be able to do what you wanted to do there. And I mean, the whole thing is pretty horrifying. And as much as Cyril is just an incel, and I'm not sorry he's dead, like, the moments of him sort of realizing what was going on and, this part that he had played in everything was, I mean, very impactful episode, obviously.
I mean, firstly, in a historical sense, fascists need enemies. They have to have them. It's that thing. If you don't already have them, they'll invent them. Fascist regimes have always been able to identify the groups which need to be crushed, and also the fact that they exist requires violent state intervention. But there's a very interesting aspect to the Empire and the Rebellion that we see, particularly in Andor, that they need each other, and they need each other to be the most extreme version to justify their existence. The Empire wants to rule the galaxy and kill everybody that they don't like and take all the stuff. They can't dial it straight up to 11. They have to do it in stages. They're patient to a point. It takes them 5 years to get to the point of extracting the stuff from the Calcite from Gorman and killing everybody. But they're not that patient. They want to get to that point quicker than they're able to get to. And to accelerate that, they need rebel atrocities, or they'll manufacture them.
Right.
But it's actually easy. It's kind of better for them to begin with if a reliable resistance movement who can be guaranteed to do the wrong thing at the right time
in front of the cameras.
In front of the camera forces the Empire to be the most extreme version of itself.
Yeah.
At the same time, in the first season of Andor, there's a brilliant conversation between Luthen and Mon Mothma at Luthen's art gallery thing, where he tells Mon Mothma that the Empire's choking us too slowly. If this carries on at this slow rate, we're never going to get this party started. And it's a moment when Mon Mothma's quite shocked that Luthen's planning on using, like, the funds and the money and for weapons. And he's like, what did you think this was ever going to be for? Did you really think that this was going to be solved by a speech in the Senate or something like that? For him to get the rebellion that he needs and that he wants, and for it to be as effective and as proactive as possible, he needs the Empire to drop the mask, and he needs the Empire to drop the mask quickly. So he'll provoke it. He'll provoke it on Gorman, he'll provoke it on Aldhani, he'll provoke it on Ferrix, he'll provoke it on a dozen other worlds, because you can't get people secretly disappearing down darkened alleyways to join the Rebel Alliance to an Empire that is killing everybody too slowly. So both the Rebellion and the Empire need each other to get this party started. And they will do what is necessary to get this party started.
So that kind of means, like, basically inevitable open war. Is there a way out of that without having the situation resort into utter violence and war?
In that Star Wars galaxy, no. It's an existential conflict. Not to say that I have no love for the Soviet Union or for Stalin, but the comparison is the Soviet Union and the Third Reich. Whilst they can make deals over Poland, and everybody involved in that should be absolutely ashamed of themselves, and it was awful. In the long term, those two states, there is no world where they can coexist together. There's going to be one, or there's going to be none. And when the Nazis invade the Soviet Union, it is a conflict to extinction. They will kill everyone, and the Soviets will do exactly the same, because it's the only way that their one gets to survive. Now, it's not a perfect comparison for the Rebel Alliance, but it's that sense of the Rebel Alliance cannot allow the Empire to exist. They can't survive if the Empire exists. Everyone's going to die sooner or later. The monster will come for everybody, in Mon Mothma's words. The Empire needs the rebellion to justify the existence of things like the Death Star, and the opportunity to use the Death Star. But having done that, the rebellion has fulfilled its purpose and now needs to be eliminated. So the Empire will not allow open resistance to continue any longer than the moment that they decided that, okay, now's the point. We'll blow up Alderaan and that's it. And now we'll crush the rebellion and this is over. So there is no universe where the Empire and the rebellion can coexist. One of them is going to have to annihilate the other, or they'll destroy them both. They can't be coexistence.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking because now if you go back and watch Rogue One and then A New Hope after watching Andor, it's like the Death Star is only operational for 2 weeks or something like that.
I've been on escalators longer than that thing lasts.
Right. Is there any way to hope that if we're talking about this allegory for the world that we're sort of living in now, is there a hope that if we let things get to Death Star levels, we can actually then, is that sort of what it takes? It literally takes blowing up Alderaan to get, this fire lit up under everybody and get the support. And then, 2 weeks later, and then, okay, we're good. We're heading out medals,
I think that unfortunately there's only so much that Mon Mothma can do in the Senate. And it's amazing. You look at Bail Organa deciding to stay in the Senate because he's like, crap, we need to stall. That Luthen, threw gasoline on this. We got to start raking back the coals because we can't take on this Death Star yet. And so we got to, build up what we need. The Empire wants to go slowly because they know they win that way. It's the frog in the boiling water.
Yeah. There's also an element of considering the chronology of it. So, it's a very fair question to say, God, is it going to take something like Alderaan to get this going? But there's always, whatever it is, there's always a moment, there's always a thing. And you can look at it in two ways. You can go, God, it took Alderaan. It would have been great for the Alderaanians if Gorman had been the moment. And it would have been great for the Gorman if Geonosis had been the moment. And it would have been great for the Geonosians if the Jedi had been the moment.
Right.
But then if you start extending that forward, having Alderaan be the moment meant that, presumably there wasn't a Mon Cala or a Chandrila. You can look at it in both directions. And the thing to bear in mind that the Death Star is very, very good example of is, and I say this with the historical gravitas of someone who, has been a historian for at least a decade now. I finished my PhD in 2013 and I started studying it in 2008. So I say this with, all of the trappings of my academic heritage. Fascists are morons and they're not smart people. They're not good at their jobs. They're not great men. They're not great thinkers. They're not luminaries. They're not good. I mean, obviously they're not good people, but they're not functional people either. The stuff they make doesn't work. The things that they try to do don't work as well as they would like them to do. It's an example I've been using quite a lot recently that Heinrich Himmler, who was the orchestrator of the Holocaust, was a failed chicken farmer. Do you know how hard it is to fail at being a chicken farmer? Chickens produce eggs themselves. You don't have to do anything. But he's so incompetent. The only thing it turned out he was ever good at, unfortunately, was murdering millions and millions of people. The Death Star is a very good example of that in that it doesn't work.
Right.
Not in the way that the Empire intended. And it's got massive flaws to it.
And it took 20 years to build and went up
in a fortnight.
Yeah.
At a fraction of the cost that it took to build. It's the equivalent of, the amount of money that gets spent in Second World War on battleships and tanks, and they get blown up, or a tank gets blown up by a 12-year-old with a Panzerfaust that cost 50 quid, or a battleship gets sunk by a single guy in a plane. It's it's much cheaper to blow these things up than it is to build them. And once you don't have it anymore, and you've based your entire strategy around having it, then you kind of have to make do. Once the Empire loses the Death Star, they have to rely on the Imperial fleet to wage their war. And that's a problem for them because the very existence of the Death Star is testimony to the fact that the Empire doesn't think the Imperial fleet can do the job. So you're relying on something that you have already deemed to be unusable for the problem at hand. And, that causes all sorts of strategic and military problems for the Empire. But the other thing about, if we're talking about, reasons to be hopeful for the future. Again, firstly, fascists are morons. Take them seriously when they say the things that they're going to do, because they mean it. Fascists are liars, but they don't lie about that type of stuff. When they say that they want to invade Poland and kill everybody, they mean it. When they say they want to annex Austria, they mean it. They're not great at nuance. But there's also never as many of them as they'd like you to think there are. So yes, we'll take Germany as an example in the Second World War. fascists, the Nazis seize the government and they create a fascist state and they go to war with everybody, and God, if only any number of things had happened before that had happened, the amount of horror and misery in the world would be dramatically less. But they never win any elections in Germany. They seize control of the government through a coup because they can't win it in the way they want to, because there aren't enough of them, and there aren't enough supporters of them. Now, again, yes, through a process of propaganda and indoctrination, like they build their own fascist state. But the point of fascist propaganda and symbiology and ideology is to make us think that there are more of them and that they speak for the majority, and what they say is the logical conclusion of rational politics. And it isn't. There aren't that many of them. There are too many. I sit here in 2025 as a historian thinking there are more Nazis nowadays than I would like there to be. But and we should be very concerned about the number that there are, but there aren't as many as they want us to think there are.
Right.
And there will always be a moment when a lot of people realise the danger and the threat of these people, and that becomes their Alderaan moment. And when we get to that moment, we should then look back and go, it would have been great if this had come a year earlier, because then this awful thing wouldn't have happened, or 2 years earlier, because then that awful thing shouldn't have happened. But the other way to look at it is to go, we're drawing a line now before the next one.
Right. Yeah, no, and I mean, I've been thinking about that for years living in the United States with mass shootings and things like that. It's like, I would have thought one of these would have been the one. Yeah,
and at some point, whether it's a blind, optimistic hope, we have to hope that one of these will be the one. But also, that doesn't mean that we should just wait until that one. We should try every time to make this one the one. And then eventually it will be.
Right. No, I like that.
And it'll mean that we stop the next one.
Right. Yeah, I like that. That gives me something a little bit more active feeling about this rather than just waiting for the next terrible thing. I at least do want to talk about Galaxy's Edge a little bit, my experience going there last month. And this was even before the ice raids really started. There's been some here in San Diego, and also, obviously, and then things really escalating with Los Angeles. But I noticed when I went to Galaxy's Edge in May, the stormtroopers, that's like literally part of the experience is that there's just a couple stormtroopers walking around, telling people they look suspicious and asking what they're doing there and asking if you've seen, these rebels or to report any activity to them. And I'm really curious if their training has changed at all, if their feelings, the people inside of those, feelings about this has changed. Because my experience being there was like, oh, this isn't fun. Like, this isn't escapism. Like, this is real, and I don't want it here in Disneyland.
Yeah. Or is it, teaching comply in advance? Like, here's your practice for what to do on the street.
Yeah. There's so I know that the 501st are a thing, and if you're listening to this, I understand the wonderful, wonderful things, the fundraising and the charity work that the 501st do. So if you're listening to this and you're a 501st member, I'm not trying to start a fight or anything like that, but it's the historian part of me that has always found it a little bit strange. When I play Star Wars computer games or when I play Star Wars tabletop games, I often play as the Empire because Star Destroyers are cool. Or when I played Star Wars Galaxies, the computer game, I was in an Imperial faction because, someone's got to be them, and also Star Destroyers are cool. Even in that level, I knew, as I suspect a lot of 501st members do, that there are those who are doing it who aren't just doing it because the Star Destroyers are cool. They're actually slightly too into it to be comfortable. And I've always wondered what the vibe is for that in the 501st. And what I think, because I haven't been to Galaxy's Edge, and probably I won't be going anytime soon. But again, I've always found that a little bit interesting, because if you're going to create an immersive Star Wars experience, there is going to be a First Order or an Imperial presence, and they're going to act like that to avoid breaking the illusion. But it's not the first time that the world has changed around Star Wars, and suddenly something that might have just been a little bit odd, potentially for, I could well imagine years ago when it was first opened, certain people in certain communities would have gone and seen those stormtroopers and been like, this one's a little close to home.
Right, no, exactly. The fact that it's just happening for me says something, right, yeah.
But what I think about quite often is that Star Wars provides a language for people to discuss reality. Ignore the last X number of years. Go all the way back into the 2000s or the 1990s. Calling a politician Darth Vader got a message across about what you thought that politician and their ideology was, regardless of whether or not it actually matched up. You know, people understood the term and what Darth Vader stood for and what the Empire stood for. So Star Wars has always provided a language. You know, when Ronald Reagan calls the Soviet Union the evil empire, people got what it was he was trying to say in regards to a Star Wars allusion. And I've always thought that Star Wars provides a language for people to understand and talk about this stuff. And you see it now online, the amount of people who are using the Gorman episode of Andor to talk about what's going on in the world. And part of that is intended and part of that is just circumstance. And I wonder whether or not that experience that you've had is presumably an experience that a lot of other people might be having at Galaxy's Edge, is giving them a framework language to talk about stuff in an easier way, because, you know, understandably, and with the best will in the world, nobody is going to go away and read like 25 different books on political science and ideology and fascist empires and oppression and authoritarianism to have a language to talk about this stuff. And even if they do, nobody else is going to go and read those books, so your language is useless. But being able to talk about it in pop culture terms, in Star Wars terms, has a utility to it. Understanding political activity in a way that people can talk about through shared reference points. So yeah, I imagine Galaxy's Edge feels real weird now, and it may get real weirder, and that might be the type of thing that Disney decide to tweak for greater or lesser extents.
Right.
But it also gives people the opportunity to experience something that they themselves and their communities might not have experienced before, but might either be experiencing now or might be about to experience in due course, and therefore a way of talking about and processing it. So it is a double-edged thing, because there is something weird and uncomfortable and that I'm not sure about.
So maybe next time I go, I can practice the, like, you know, ice resistance training or whatever that I'm planning to sign up for.
Am I allowed to swear on your podcast? It's been a slogan of anti-fascist protests and various kind of anti-totalitarian, anti-authoritarian protests for years, and it's the "you make me." So now I don't necessarily know if you should say that at Galaxy's Edge, right? Some stormtroopers in front of a bunch of kids, but there's that element of, you know, those stormtroopers can't actually make you do it because they're cast members in character, but it would be interesting. You can puncture it in character, in universe, by them going, you know, coming up to you and going, you know, you look suspicious, show me your papers, make me. And then see what they say, see what happens, and try it out in a safe environment.
Right. Yeah, worst I could do is get kicked out of Disneyland, maybe.
Yeah, 100%.
I don't want to be on. I don't want to be on that list, but no, I like that. We also never got around to the fact that this is episode 66 and talking about Order 66. But
oh god, I expect to be executed very momentarily. It was always going to end like this.
Well, you know, the Sith only deal in absolutes, and obviously, you know, Revenge of the Sith came out the same time as President Bush of the United States saying something very similar, that you're you know, either with us or you're with them, and kind of something similar to what Anakin says.
Yeah, and again, that wasn't a coincidence from George Lucas. I don't care what he says. You know, that's he intended that comparison. Maybe not so much for the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, because they are coming out. You know, the way that movies are made. You know, Phantom Menace comes out before 9/11, before George Lucas is president, and Attack of the Clones comes out before the Iraq War really begins. But Revenge of the Sith lands right in the sweet spot, and you know the amount of references, even the scene of the Jedi Temple burning or having smoke coming out of it on Coruscant the morning after Order 66. I remember sitting in the cinema in 2005, recognizing that I was looking at George Lucas's version of the Twin Towers. That, you know, this is the morning that everything changed. And, you know, George Lucas, for all the criticisms that people give him, and some people do give this as a criticism, George Lucas is not a subtle man. You know, he likes to paint his references in big letters and in big
everything is literally black and white.
Yeah.
Everything is literally black and white. It's a failure of the audience that we sometimes don't get it. That isn't George Lucas's fault, and it's not necessarily George Lucas's problem that people haven't gotten that Star Wars is political. That's on us. It's not on George Lucas.
Well, any final thoughts? I mean, that was a pretty good one, if not.
That is a pretty good one. I don't know if I can be more insightful than that. Hope is a good thing. Hope is the thing that drives you on even when things feel hopeless, and there were never as many fascists as they would like you to think there are.
Yeah.
And as Nemec says, try.
Yeah,
Right.
100%. I've always
The
loved
Empire's
that
brittle.
Right.
as almost as a critique of Yoda thing. And I think we mentioned this in London, that, when Yoda is telling Luke and other Jedi, do or do not, there is no try. It's a slightly different message to what Nemec's trying to get across. But I do still see it as a slight critique of Yoda, because there is a virtue to trying to do something and to be seen to trying to do something, even if you don't succeed. Nemec doesn't live much beyond his manifesto, and he doesn't live to see the triumph of the Rebel Alliance. But his words motivate people, and other people got to see him try. Other people got to see a lot of people try. No, very few people who were in Andor or in Rogue One, and virtually nobody who's in Rogue One is in A New Hope. And even less of them are in Return of the Jedi. But they tried and were seen to try, and it's important that is a thing. To be seen to be trying to do something has a value.
Yeah. Yeah. The other one I was thinking of was, I have friends everywhere. So
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do. We do have friends everywhere. And traditionally you find each other.
Cool. Well, thanks, Chris.
Amazing.
This is a really amazing conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Feel more informed. I feel a little bit more hopeful, even if it's going to take Collins or the Alderaan incident. I just, having a little bit more context here, and also being backed up in my idea that, like, this isn't new. This isn't woke. Like, go away.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris.
Absolutely my pleasure. I always love coming on and filling everybody with, bleak horror.
It's not you. It's, gestures vaguely at the world. It's
yeah.
You're just the one that gives us some context. That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Chris Kempshall, and we want to thank all of you for listening.
Are you looking for links to what we talked about? Check out our show notes page available at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. Also check out our YouTube channel where we post episodes with related visuals from Star Wars.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies, or an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Instagram and Blue Sky, or at Star Warsologies, that's OLOGIES, @gmail.com. And we also have a fan group on Facebook named Star Warsologies Podcast Fan Group. So join today and chat with us and your fellow listeners.
Please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service and share with your friends. Hey, also, we're going to be at San Diego Comic-Con coming up in July. I'm going to be doing a panel on Andor because it's one of my favorite things. It will be Star Wars Andor, Resistance and Rebellion, especially looking at Season 2 and current events. So hope to see you there. Remember, for Star Warsologies, no topic is off limits. Even if they made a skincare product from Gorman, would it be deep substrate exfoliating calcite? Also, my Star Wars book, Star Wars Crossword Puzzles and Other Word Games from a Galaxy Far, Far Away, is out from Chronicle Books and is available at your local bookstore or on online booksellers like bookshop.org, Amazon, and Barnes & Noble.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including the Neverland Clubhouse and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show called Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com. See you next time on Star Warsologies, when we talk about Star Wars in Bulgaria with someone we met at Star Wars Celebration.
Remember, try.
Try. I like it. And you have friends everywhere.